The summer air of Mississippi in 1861 pressed down like a wet cloth, thick with heat and the smell of damp earth and smoke. Cicadas screamed through the trees, their endless cry warning of something unseen. At the edge of the fields, the rows of slave quarters sagged under the weight of years, while the white-pillared house gleamed against the sky, proud yet hollow, its strength only a shell. Beneath its polished surface, rot waited. And within those walls and within those cabins lived the night this story was born, the night the fire chose its path, a story most never dare to finish. Will you? Legends like this don't often reach the light. Subscribe now, so you'll be here each time we uncover the truths history tried to hide. Your click is the signal to keep stitching these stories back together, ember by ember. While you listen, share where you're watching from. It's striking to see how many distant places come together through a single thread of history, how far the smoke of this night still travels. The world of the Tisdale plantation was held together by silence and fear, its fields stretching out like a wound that refused to heal. The masters walked its soil with the certainty of men who believed time belonged to them, that even the beginning of war could not shake their dominion. Their whips sang daily, their laughter broke across the yard, their commands rolled like thunder from porches lit with lanterns. But beneath that surface, something older stirred, something the masters could not control. Every cry hushed too quickly, every glance exchanged when backs were turned, every song whispered into the dark carried a rhythm the owners could not hear. 9 men ruled this patch of land, 9 voices that carved order into misery. They carried arrogance like armor, their boots pressing into the dust as though the world itself bent beneath them. They drank deep into the night, boasting of politics and power, certain the war raging in distant fields would never touch their wealth. To them, the quarters were cages that never rattled, places where obedience lived and breath was borrowed, never owned. Yet in those same quarters, another kind of memory was being woven, one of hunger, grief, loss, and the knowledge that no whip could burn out the need for justice. Among the enslaved, there were men and women who had carried generations of pain in silence, who had buried children too small to cry out, who had watched brothers broken, who had listened to the crack of leather until the sound no longer startled but became part of the air. Their silence was not consent. It was waiting. And in that waiting, a plan began to form, not shouted or spoken, but breathed into the stillness like smoke. The quarters themselves told the story. The wood was dry, splintered with age, the roofs patched with straw that caught the smallest ember. The floors groaned when stepped upon, the windows were nothing more than holes stuffed with cloth to keep the cold away. To the masters, it was enough, a place to keep bodies alive and souls quiet. To those inside, it was a tinderbox, a prison built of fuel, waiting only for the right hand to strike a spark. The days before the fire stretched long, each hour heavy with work and hunger. Cotton lay piled in the sheds, sacks heavy with seed, while the overseers rode through the rows, their shouts echoing against the trees. Night brought no rest, only the thud of boots and the smell of whiskey as the 9 gathered in their hall, their laughter spilling into the cold like a wound. Each night their games grew louder, their cruelty sharper, as though they knew something was slipping from their grasp. War had begun in the nation, but here they clung to their illusions, blind to the storm pressing closer. But those who labored beneath them were not blind. They heard the whispers carried from road to road, of battles fought, of armies marching, of proclamations spoken in Washington. The news came twisted, broken by mouths that despised it, but the meaning was clear, the old world was cracking. Freedom was no longer an impossible dream. It was a shadow moving nearer, and with it came the courage to act. Samuel, Mary, Elijah, Ruth, names whispered now like fragments of prayer, were among those who began to turn silence into decision. They did not meet in open. They did not speak freely. They learned to hide words in songs, to mark paths with stones, to nod where others would not see. Their eyes followed the masters, memorizing their steps, their habits, their nights of drink. Every boast was measured, every slip of arrogance recorded, every weakness stitched into memory. It was not rage that guided them, but patience. It was not chance, but choice. The fire was not born in one moment, but in years of watching, years of grief pressed down into embers. It lived in the calloused hands that stitched torn cloth, in the backs scarred by mercy's lash, in the graves dug too shallow for the children lost. It lived in the silence Samuel carried, in the songs Ruth hummed, in the prayers whispered not for salvation but for strength. The masters had never seen it. They had never looked close enough. But it was there, waiting, dry as the straw, sharp as the frost, heavy as the night itself. And when the moment came, it would not roar at first. It would whisper. It would breathe itself into the corners, crawl along the rafters, curl through the cracks, until the silence broke open and the night itself burned. The quarters would not only carry bodies that night. They would carry history, lit by fire, remembered not in records, but in ash and shadow. The nights before the fire were heavy with a kind of waiting that could not be named. The quarters filled with low voices and the scrape of weary hands, but behind each movement lay an unspoken current. The war had broken open in distant fields, yet here the masters still laughed as though nothing had changed, as though no proclamation in Washington could cross their fences or enter their fields. They boasted that their land was eternal, their cotton endless, their control unshaken. But every laugh was sharper now, every word edged with fear, and those beneath them felt it like a shift in the weather. The enslaved carried silence like a cloak, but inside them, silence had turned into stone. Mothers hummed to children with voices cracked from grief. Men sharpened tools for morning work, but tested their edges as if measuring something deeper, and the old ones sat in the corners of cabins with eyes half shut, remembering other nights when change had been whispered and crushed. Samuel's quiet gaze followed the overseers as they passed, counting each step, marking each pause in their routine. Mary bent over the wash with hands rubbed raw, but her ears gathered every word spilled from the big house porch. Ruth lit candles slowly, her flame catching more than wax. It caught memory, and it carried it forward. The 9 men who ruled the plantation grew reckless as the rumors spread. They gathered in the hall long after dark, their boots scraping against the floor, dice clattering across wood, their voices rising in drunken games. To them, cruelty was not only power but pastime. They traded stories of punishment as if they were trophies, boasting of the ways they had bent bodies and broken wills. But in their boasting they left something behind, a map of their habits, a trail of their arrogance, a pattern that could be followed. They never saw the eyes in the shadows measuring them, never felt the silence coiling tighter around their steps. The cabins were tinder waiting for a spark, their dry walls stitched with straw, their roofs patched with kindling. The masters never cared, so long as the bodies inside rose with the dawn and bent to their command. But the enslaved saw what the masters did not. They saw how fire could run through those walls faster than a whip's crack, how smoke could gather quicker than orders, how one ember could become judgment. They whispered this knowledge not with words, but with looks, with the rhythm of work songs that shifted just enough to carry meaning, with the tap of fingers against knees as if keeping time. Every day was measured by endurance, but every night began to feel like rehearsal. The children sensed it in the way adults grew quieter when the wind blew from the hall, in the way voices fell when dice rattled, in the way no one sang of hope but only of memory. The elders nodded as though they had waited too long for such a season, as though they knew fire had always been part of the story. And Samuel, who spoke least of all, moved with a calmness that hid the weight inside him. His silence no longer mocked by the overseers, but feared by those who wondered what waited beneath it. The masters felt the unease, but mistook it for obedience. They saw bowed heads and thought fear had won again. They did not see the ledger Samuel kept in his mind, the marks he carved in silence for every life stolen, every lash given, every laugh thrown into the air while blood still wet the soil. He carried those names as if they were stones, each one building a wall inside him, each one pressing him toward the night when silence would break. The fire was not spoken aloud, not even once. To say it would have been to risk its death before it began. But its presence filled the air. It lived in the way hands lingered too long over the hearth, in the way eyes measured the distance from cabin to hall, in the way voices hushed when the wind carried the smell of smoke from some far-off field. The masters never noticed. They never thought their world could end in flame. They never thought the walls they built to hold others could become their own cage. As the nights grew longer, the waiting grew sharper. It was no longer if, but when. The soil seemed to hold its breath, the trees bent closer as though listening, the sky itself lowering as though preparing to witness. And when the moment came, when the ember was carried from hand to hand, it would not need a word. It would only need silence, and the silence had been waiting for years. The night came without warning, though every breath in the quarters had been waiting for it. The air was heavy and close, as if the sky itself leaned lower to press against the earth. Clouds drifted across a moon half hidden, throwing shadows that stretched long and uncertain across the fields. The cicadas hushed in their trees, and even the dogs curled near the sheds grew restless, whining low as though they sensed what the men in the hall could not. The 9 masters drank deep that evening. Their boots thudded against the floorboards, chairs scraped, dice rattled, voices rose in drunken pride. They laughed louder than the crackling fire in the hearth, their words spilling out thick with whiskey and arrogance. Outside, the quarters crouched in silence, doors shut, windows dark, though behind those doors men and women did not sleep. They sat with their backs against the walls, eyes open, hearts beating with the slow rhythm of something long awaited. No one spoke of what would come, but every ear strained toward the hall, counting each shout, each burst of laughter, measuring the hours until the fire's time arrived. The flame began small, no larger than a breath cupped in a hand. It passed quietly from one set of fingers to another, a candle stub shielded from the wind, a spark that had been nursed from the hearth and carried carefully through the night. It touched the dry straw at the edge of the cabins, curling it to smoke before it grew into hunger. The masters, blinded by drink and boasting, never smelled it. Their eyes fixed on the roll of dice, their hands heavy with cards, they did not see the shadows moving outside, did not hear the soft crackle rising beneath their laughter. Smoke licked the walls before the fire revealed itself. At first it was a whisper, then a murmur, then a sudden roar that climbed high into the rafters. The quarters flared like dry bone, flames snapping across wood that had waited too long to burn. The wind caught it and spread it faster than any hand could stop, faster than any prayer could silence. The hall where the 9 sat filled with heat before they understood what had happened. Windows glowed orange, the air thickened, shouts turned from laughter to panic. They stumbled to the doors, but found them blocked, jammed with beams and stones placed quietly in the hours before. They clawed at shutters nailed fast, their fists slamming against the walls they had once ruled. Outside, the enslaved stood in the fields, their faces lit by the rising glow. Some wept, some sang low, some only watched. The fire painted their eyes with light, the same light that burned through the night sky like a wound torn open. No cheer rose, no shout of triumph. The silence was heavier than the flames, a silence that spoke more than words could. Children clung to their mothers, their small bodies trembling as sparks rained down like stars. The old ones bowed their heads, their lips moving in prayers that carried both grief and release. The young stood still, their hands clenched, their chests rising with breaths they had never dared to take so deeply before. The 9 men screamed inside, their voices lost in the roar of the blaze. They pounded against the doors, called for mercy, cursed the shadows outside, but no answer came. Smoke filled their throats, fire ate the walls, heat cracked the beams above. One tried to leap from a window, but fell back against the flames, his clothes alight before he reached the ground. Another clawed at the roof, pulling loose splinters that broke in his hands. The hall that had once echoed with their laughter now echoed with the last sounds they would ever make. The fire rose higher, swallowing the quarters, leaping from roof to roof until the sky glowed red. Sparks drifted into the trees, ash fell across the cotton fields like snow. The enslaved did not move to stop it. They stood still, as though rooted to the earth, as though the fire itself had spoken for them. In the glow of the inferno, their silence became a verdict, their waiting became a sentence carried out by flame. The 9 who had once ruled this land were trapped within the cage they had built, their power burning to ash around them. When the roof collapsed, the sound rolled across the fields like thunder. The ground shook with the weight of falling beams, the air split with sparks that showered into the night. Then came silence again, deep and final, broken only by the crackle of dying wood. The enslaved turned away slowly, one by one, retreating into the dark with no words spoken, no glances exchanged. They did not celebrate. They did not grieve. They only carried the knowledge that the world had shifted, that the fire had carved something into the soil that could never be erased. By dawn, the plantation lay in smoke. The quarters were blackened shells, the hall a heap of charred timber and ash. No bodies were carried out. No names were spoken. The 9 men had vanished into the fire, their power reduced to cinders scattered on the wind. The enslaved moved through the fields as though nothing had changed, their faces calm, their hands steady, their silence unbroken. But in their hearts they carried the memory of the night when silence burned, the night when fire answered the lash. The dawn that followed was thin and gray, as if even the sun hesitated to rise above the smoke that still curled from the ruins. The sky bore no warmth, only a pale light that made the ash shimmer across the yard like frost. The air reeked of charred wood and scorched flesh, a stench that clung to every breath, heavy and unrelenting. The cotton fields, untouched by flame, stretched outward in silence, their whiteness ghostly against the black ruin at their heart. The enslaved moved carefully, their steps measured, their faces blank. They did not linger near the wreckage, though their eyes could not help but glance toward it. Where the great hall had once stood proud, there was now only a heap of collapsed beams, their bones still glowing faint with embers. The white columns that had marked the master's authority lay cracked and blackened, toppled into the soot like fallen giants. The slave quarters nearby were little more than black shells, walls hollowed and roofs gone. And beneath it all, unseen but felt, the bodies of 9 men who had once ruled without fear now lay consumed, their names erased in fire. No one wept for them. No one dared to rejoice either. The quarters were filled with silence, a silence sharper than any scream. Mothers held their children close, pressing hands over small mouths to keep them from speaking what might betray them. The men bent their backs to the morning's work as though nothing had changed, though each swing of the hoe struck the ground with a weight that had never been there before. The old ones nodded with eyes closed, as if they had lived long enough to know the earth had simply reclaimed what it was owed. Rumors traveled faster than smoke. By noon, neighbors rode in from adjoining plantations, their horses stamping nervously as they stared at the wreck. They dismounted slowly, walking among the ashes, speaking in low tones of accident, of drunken carelessness, of God's wrath. None spoke of vengeance. None dared. For to say such a word aloud would mean admitting that silence could rise and consume its masters. They asked questions, but found no answers, only the wreckage of walls and the smell of fire. When pressed, the enslaved lowered their eyes and spoke of lamps overturned, of sparks from the hearth, of a wind that blew too strong. They said nothing of what they had seen, nothing of what they had heard, nothing of what they had carried in their hearts. Their silence was their shield. The surviving family of the masters wailed in the big house, their cries ringing across the yard, piercing in their grief. But their grief was for power lost, for wealth undone, for the certainty of dominion turned suddenly to ash. They mourned the collapse of their world, not the cruelty that had sustained it. They spoke of rebuilding, of vengeance against any who might have played a hand in it, but their words fell hollow, carried away by the smoke that still rose faint from the ruins. For the fire had done more than burn wood and flesh. It had cracked something deeper, something in the soil itself, something that no whip or chain could bind again. The enslaved knew it. They felt it in their bones. They walked the fields with heads low, but their eyes shone with a hidden strength, their silence ringing louder than the overseers' voices had ever done. The fire had spoken for them, had answered years of lashes and cries with one night of flame. Though the world around them demanded obedience, though the war itself still raged beyond their fields, they carried within them the memory of a night when silence was verdict and fire was witness. By evening the ash settled, the smoke thinned, and the fields returned to their rhythm of labor. But the air never felt the same again. Each step upon the soil was heavier, as if the ground itself remembered. And in that remembering, fear took root not in the enslaved, but in those who had thought themselves untouchable. The fire had revealed a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, but impossible to forget, that silence waits, and when it breaks, it consumes. The years that followed carried the fire into silence, but silence is never empty. The ruin of that night became part of the land itself, and though no record was written, though no preacher spoke it from a pulpit, though no family dared to mark it with stone or scripture, the story did not vanish. It moved like smoke, thin and drifting, clinging to walls and trees, lingering in corners where shadows gathered. It traveled in whispers between quarters, from one plantation to another, from lips too cautious to speak in daylight, but unafraid to murmur in the dark. Children born after the flames learned of it before they could remember their own names. Old women bent low in their chairs would lift trembling hands to hush a child's questions, then lean close to tell them of a night when fire swallowed 9 men whole. They never spoke of who lit the first spark, never spoke of names, never claimed what could cost them everything. But they told of the silence, of how the people stood and watched without lifting a hand, of how the fire itself did the work no whip could undo. The lesson was not vengeance. It was memory. And memory survived. The masters who remained carried fear like a shadow. They rebuilt walls, replaced roofs, hired new overseers, but none of them slept without unease. At night, when the wind shifted, they smelled ash even when none burned. They avoided the field where the ruins lay, building fences to hide it from sight, planting trees to blot it from memory. But the earth does not forget. Rain carved lines through the black soil, exposing charred timbers each season, bringing pieces of iron, buttons, and bone back to the surface. Each fragment whispered of the night when silence broke and fire became judgment. As the war raged on, the plantation fell into decline. Men who had once strutted through the yard with rifles were dragged away to fight, many never to return. The cotton grew wild, weeds climbing higher than crops, fences sagging without repair. The enslaved still worked, but they worked in a place hollowed out, a place where every sunrise reminded them of the ash buried beneath their feet. For them, the fire had not brought freedom, not yet. Chains still bound, whips still cracked, orders still cut like knives. But in their hearts they carried something no master could take, the proof that power could burn, that those who claimed eternity could be gone in a single night. When emancipation finally came, it did not come with horns or trumpets, but with riders weary from war, carrying papers whose ink felt too fragile to hold such weight. Many left the fields with only bundles of rags, their feet blistered, their faces set toward roads they had never walked. Some stayed, tied to the soil that had consumed so much of their lives. But whether they stayed or fled, all carried the memory of the night of fire, a memory sharper than any map, stronger than any sermon. Years turned into decades, and still the story lingered. Farmers plowing the land long after the war claimed their blades struck stone where none should be, iron warped and blackened from heat. Children dared each other to creep near the ruins at dusk, swearing they heard the crackle of flames though no fire burned. Preachers passing through the county lowered their voices when asked about it, saying only that some nights, judgment comes not from heaven, but from the ground beneath our feet. The tale was never written in the county ledgers, never spoken in the courts, never admitted by those who lost. But the soil bore witness, and the soil spoke to those who listened. By the time the century turned, the white columns were gone, The big house collapsed into rot, the cabins overgrown with vines. The land changed hands, sold and divided, the memory of its past buried beneath new deeds and new fences. Yet the fire remained. Some swore the pecan trees near the ruins grew twisted, their trunks blackened at the roots though no flame touched them again. Others said the air grew heavier there in summer, a heat that pressed harder than elsewhere, a heat that smelled faintly of smoke even after rain. The fire had left no monument but itself. Stories traveled further than the land. Freed families carried them north, told them in kitchens and parlors, passed them to children who had never seen the quarters but knew their shape from words alone. The tale shifted, grew in fragments, changed in names and numbers, but its heart remained the same, that on one night in 1861, fire answered cruelty, and 9 men who believed themselves eternal vanished into ash. Historians who came later searched for records, but the archives were empty. They wrote of accidents, of lamps overturned, of careless sparks. They named it tragedy, not vengeance, erasing the silence that had chosen not to speak. But no pen could erase the whispers that still moved beneath the surface, whispers carried in song, in prayer, in the eyes of those who remembered. The night of fire lived on, not in books or sermons, but in the soil, in the roots of trees, in the breath of children who heard it before sleep. It became a story of silence more than flame, of how power falls not always with noise, but sometimes with waiting, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with the quiet watching of those who have been denied voice. The 9 men became nothing but ash, but the silence endured. And the silence grew, passing from one generation to the next, until it was no longer just memory, but warning.